as esports continues to grow, continues to have more viewers, continues to have more cachet in terms of mainstream appeal and in terms of influence among young people and people within that juicy demographic of the 18 to 24-year-old white male who has disposable income, more and more companies want to get involved, whether that's through sponsorship, that's through in any way organizing esports themselves. But now we see these big companies getting involved. News corporations, people who want to run leagues, people like ESPN who want to cover leagues. And yet some of these very same people, particularly the ones I've just referred to, were at times in the past not just unfriendly towards esports, but essentially set themselves against esports and worked against esports and gaming in general, and were essentially enemies of esports. I mean, most of the time these stories I'm talking about were mainly addressing gamers in general, the phenomenon of gaming as a subculture, and people who enjoy playing games as a hobby and like to play lots of single player and multiplayer games. But since esports is a subculture of that, is a niche from within that bit larger field or realm, they were essentially against esports itself as well. From the early 2000s onwards, there were many, many stories across the majority of mainstream media outlets, people like the BBC, ESPN, NBC, well, maybe not ESPN that much because it's sports, obviously, but NBC, CBS in America, all these sorts of news networks which carry news stories, where the stories were full of connections between school shootings that were happening and the fact that the people who killed in those school shootings were gamers themselves, and trying to draw a connection or trying to suggest a connection could be there, or implying that games make people violent, all these sorts of things. This was the ambience of the early 2000s. And obviously this was primarily in the USA, but also notably in Germany and Europe. That was another big area where it was going on, and there was a lot of banning of games and games having to be modified there. Now, understandably, this was launched essentially by the Columbine shootings in 1999. People were looking for reasons why. The families of the people who were killed there even tried to sue video game makers, saying that video games caused this kind of thing. The games that people were pointed at were Doom, later on Quake, Mortal Kombat, games which obviously have a violent nature to them. And almost all these stories in the early 2000s conveniently ignored the fact that the majority of people who play PC games are nerds, and back when they did play Quake and Counter-Strike and StarCraft, the majority of PC gamers had played these games. These were the most popular multiplayer games, and many of these games had a single player component of their era. So it's not that people played those games and were then made more violent, etc. It's that these were incredibly popular games among PC gamers, and so pretty much everyone had played them. Therefore, the odds on someone being a school shooter and having played any kind of video game and not played these games were pretty low, actually. Most people owned them. In fact, Quake and StarCraft famously were owned for the single player aspect. Obviously, Counter-Strike was a multiplayer game, but even then, people who owned Half-Life as a single-player game, a fantastic, very well-selling single-player game, could get Counter-Strike for free because it was a mod for it. It also tended to ignore early on that the sort of person who had any kind of latent qualities that might lead them to one day be a school shooter or be incredibly violent would probably automatically have played these games anyway. They're putting the cart before the horse. It's not that he plays the game then becomes the violent. It's that people who like violence are going to naturally, if they play video games, want to play violent video games. This is going to be a very good way to enjoy that, or some element or some minor virtual representation of that. It's not the other way around, that they were a normal person, then the video game made them violent. That seems quite unreasonable, especially with studies that have come out since. Now, there was also an example of where they mainly said it was Doom for the Columbine shootings, but then there was the Winnenden school shooting where they said that this guy played Counter-Strike, and they said that the killer had played Counter-Strike and Call of Duty. Then you had... Oh no, wait a second. It was the Counter-Strike and Call of Duty one was 2012. That was the Adam Lanza Connecticut shooting. That was the one where they said that. One of the things these channels would do is, if early on they themselves would present this as a reason and make stories like, oh, is this what's going on? And very rarely present the other side or counter arguments. But one of the things they did, even in the mid-2000s onwards, when they started to get a bit more hip and not directly blame video games as though there was no reason, and would ask more questions, even then they'd have whole stories and whole segments where they would provide a platform for people who were campaigning against gamers, and essentially esports is a subculture of that, because it's part of Quake and Doom are esports games and StarCraft. StarCraft and Call of Duty, they would provide a platform for these people without actually questioning those people hard and go, yes, but the studies here said this, what do you say to that? They would just give these people a platform, ask them the simple softball questions and let that guy hit it out of the park all day long about how it's gamers and all that. So one of the people, the most egregious examples, is they constantly gave a platform to this guy called Jack Thompson. Jack was actually an adopted name. His name was like John Bryce or something like that. Jack Thompson, who he blamed Counter-Strike, Doom, Grand Theft Auto, and he blamed these games for shootings in Littleton, Colorado, Red Lake, Minnesota, what's that called? Paddock. I don't even know where that is. Paddock. I don't know where the fuck it is. I'm not from America, mate. So you can see the point is they gave these people a platform so these people could go off all the time. And the people we're talking about, by the way, is the BBC, is NBC, is CBS. These people now who constantly flirt with gaming and want to get involved in gaming, want to be part of broadcasting gaming, and make out like they're friends to gaming. And yet they were the ones providing the propaganda arm to allow this shit to get out there and to get into so many people's heads. Often, in the early cases especially, without any sort of questioning, glance upon it or trying to frame it in a reasonable way, or have someone say that, oh, I think gaming did this, but then have someone on who's a neuroscientist who says, well, actually, we didn't find any evidence of this or something, or a sociologist who says, well, that hasn't quite been proven. They often wouldn't provide that counterbalance in that particular sense. I mean, NBC particularly is quite interesting because 2005, there was the guy called Jeff Weiss, who was a shooter in Minnesota Red Lake of Minnesota, rather, and there's an interview that they published where it said that he'd made this animation, which if you looked at the way the animation moved forwards, was just like following like a video game script. They did an interview with this person saying all that stuff. They never provided any counterbalance in that article. A guy called Phil McGraw, a day or so after the Virginia Tech shootings, appeared on Larry King Live and just went off about video games. He said, and here's a quote, "You cannot tell me, common sense tells you that if these kids are playing video games where they're on a mass killing spree in a video game, it's glamorized on the big screen, it's become part of the fiber of our society. You can take that and mix it with a psychopath, a sociopath, or someone suffering from mental illness and add in a dose of rage. The suggestibility is too high and we're going to have to start dealing with that." Which obviously doesn't acknowledge the fact that there are psychopaths, sociopaths, people that deal with rage in other countries who play these games, and the amount of shootings in other countries compared to America, massively low. So, CNN, even as recent as like 2012, CNN did a piece about Marine King, the great, all-time great StarCraft 2 pro, Korean, playing in World Cyber Games 2011, an event that he was considered one of the players who had a chance to win the event, very likely to make top 4, get a medal maybe. He actually in the end went out in the quarterfinals to Kaz, the Ukrainian player who upset him in a Terran versus Terran match. Now the whole piece that they wrote, and remember they spent time with Marine King, time with his family, they had a chance to write a wonderful piece about the hardships of gaming and stuff, and they did do some of that, but it was all wrapped up in this one theme that was, are gamers in Korea and other countries and playing these games addicts? And they tried to constantly frame it that Marine King himself, a pro gamer, is an addict. The whole piece constantly suggests he's an addict, constantly references the amount of time he plays, despite the fact the time he plays is because he's one of the best in a very competitive game one of the best in the world, an extremely competitive game. I mean, the reason why I point this out, that they kept emphasizing the time he played, is that it was this crazy absurd thing that showed he was an addict, is because imagine them talking about a basketball player like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or Larry Bird and the extra hours these guys putting in the gym and making out like they're addicted or there's something mentally wrong with them, or maybe they're not looking after their family life and they're not having a healthy balanced life. This never happens. The stories are written about those guys putting in the extra hours, but they're lionized, as they should be, as being people who are in a very competitive discipline, and then they're going above and beyond because they're driven, obsessed to be the greatest, and their success in the sport somehow justifies that, yet his success in the game doesn't justify this aspect in the way they reference the story. They constantly reference how this had ruined his family life, without, by the way, almost never mentioning the effect on Korean culture, where in Korean culture, they'd want you to spend the same amount of time studying to be a doctor. They don't want you to spend the same amount of time into Korean culture trying to be the best at anything you do. They mentioned that 8% of Koreans between 9 and 39 suffer from one of these forms of addiction, brought up in a study. They brought up the case, as they always do, of that fucking kid dying because his mum played some virtual game where they looked after a virtual kid, as though this has any relevance to Marine King's case, who's the main body of the stories about Marine King. And yes, towards the end, they finally talk to this psychologist, and he says that, yeah, people who play as much as Marine King might actually be addicted, But then he makes the key point. He says there's one difference. Pro gamers usually aren't addicts because addicts can't succeed on a high competitive level, and the game takes such control over them that they don't practice in a purposeful way and they won't succeed on this level. Whereas obviously Marine King did succeed on this level. So essentially at the end of the article, they find out, if you look at this piece of compelling evidence, or a very reasonable hypothesis and thesis and theory in terms of the evidence this guy's looked at, to suggest that Marine King isn't an addict, but that's after a massive article where it's all about him being addicted. It's all implying as much, it's all putting a platform forwards for that without asking more questions beyond that. And this is in 2012 we're talking about now. So all these people are coming in. ESPN's coming in now, where they've done stories about Adderall, about how gamers are drug addicts, etc., and how there's this huge problem going on there, even though they've repeatedly exaggerated and sensationalized it and taken the facts and then run with them and tried to make them seem more sexy, as though everyone in Counter-Strike and Call of Duty are all addicts on drugs and StarCraft players. So all these people have done all these things, but the problem is that was when gaming was smaller. That was when they didn't necessarily want to be in gaming. That was when they covered sports. They're not covering gaming, no problem. Now they want to be part of gaming. Now they want to broadcast gaming. Now they want to hold their own tournaments and leagues. What do we think of this? Well, since these people were enemies of esports, here's the thing. I'm not against the notion that your enemy has to be your enemy forever and that you'll never forgive this person and fuck them forever and we'll never allow them any ground. No. Here's the thing. I believe in forgiving these people. If these people come to us and they say, no, we've changed our mind. Listen, it's a change of heart. We were wrong about that. We want to come in. Good. They've said the right things. Now we forgive them. And as much as we can, we let go of the resentment towards these people for the things they've done and the way they've portrayed us as addicts in terms of Adderall, as school shooters and people who are violent, who enjoy violence in any way. I don't enjoy violence in any way, and I love these games. People who are misogynists in terms of the Gamergate shit, repeatedly presenting Gamergate as though it was actually just an Illuminati type conspiracy of people who hate women, not just a few people within that saying things that are hateful towards women, while many of the people there were actually boycotting some bullshit to do with how games journalism was done. These people have presented that way, but now we're going to let go of some of that resentment if we can, especially if they've shown that they want to offer the olive branch, offer that peace pipe. They want to show that they want to change and start showing gaming in a positive light. So there might be also, you have to consider, new people at these companies. Maybe the old guard has changed to some degree. Maybe they've moved past. Maybe they're not going to be involved in this. Maybe there's new people who even were from gaming. So obviously we want to forgive them in that sense. We want to allow these people a platform to succeed and change the culture inside those companies so that eventually they have a reasonable approach towards gaming. Also, we want to bring these people in to our culture. We want to have them be part of it and broadcast our games and bring money in and bring non-endemic sponsors in. But we're going to do it on our terms. That's why we're going to forgive them, but we're not going to forget what they've done. And we're going to make sure they come in on our terms and they change to what we are and they become part of us and we assimilate them. Not the other way around, where we're just letting them involved and now they run everything and they get to have done what they did in the past and now set the terms for us now. Never forget what these people have done, that they were once enemies. Now, have they changed their mind? This is a real question to ask, because of a progression in how they've thought about the game and understanding and philosophical approach to the game, or have they changed their mind cynically just because gaming has become a big thing, because it's become a viable business interest, because more and more money's in it and more people watch it? That's why we have to not forget what they've done. So we have to look for the warning signs that they're just cynically getting involved here. Likewise, we also have to check, if we can, when someone comes into esports from these big companies, these big mainstream companies, the enemies of esports, we have to ask, are these any of the same people who were involved with all that behavior before, where they cast us in this terrible light? Are these the same editors who push those stories? Are they the same journalists? If they are, then we have to be very careful how we deal with these people. We have to let them know that it wasn't acceptable what they did before. If they're new people, okay, fine. Clean slates, a new set of people. But we have to let them know also, when they deal with us, this is the way we've been dealt with before. So we want to be sure that your stories are going to be reasonable in the way they're done, and let them know that we won't accept what happened before. We also have to not just take their claims at face value when they say, oh, I'm super involved in esports, I love esports, I follow it all the time. Because in light of their history, I know mainstream journalists, and mainstream journalists will just say this stuff to people when they get into a scene, because they want to win them over and get friendship with them and make them believe, hey, I'm into the things you're into. Now you can be open with me and tell me what you think. I want to see the proof that these people are involved. I've seen so many people come along in mainstream companies like I'm talking about last couple of years, write a couple of big articles or one big article about gaming. Everyone lauds them, says, oh, well, if they say, oh, I'd love to get into esports. A year later, they still haven't watched any games more. They've watched like 1 or 2 matches. They say they follow one team, but they don't really understand the game or even any of the, like, who the better teams are. They're not doing more work on the side. They're not getting more involved. They had that one piece they were commissioned to do, did well, and they've moved back to the rest of their job. They don't really care about esports like they told you they did. And I find it quite condescending when somebody who doesn't really follow the games tells me he's super into it, he's the #1 fan of this player. Fuck you. No, you're not. We're those people. There's also the fact that these people coming in now will pretend to be heavily involved. That's why I want to know with the new arrivals, if there were people who were in the scene before, if they did follow the game before, what their reasons for following the game are. Not just someone telling me he's involved in the game. So, okay, like I said, these people were the enemies of esports. They pit themselves in that way, and they made us their enemies. They painted us as their enemies, and enemies of culture and society in general, and people who don't want to get shot or be drug addicts or women who don't like hate on the internet. But they want to get involved now. Good. Then we're going to forgive them if they're presenting a face where they're sorry and they want to be involved now and they know that what they did was fucked up. But we're not going to forget the things they did, and we're going to make sure they come in on reasonable terms, and we're going to be skeptical and careful early on. And eventually one day it won't matter, and eventually one day all these people will report things because it'll be such a massive phenomenon that it won't be an issue. But right now we've got to be careful. We've got to remember that these were the enemies of esports, and that can't just be forgotten.